Hello, I'm Sean, and today I'd like to, well, not ruin a classic Christmas franchise, but maybe cast some new light on it, because here's the deal. The Santa Claus movies, and now the Santa Claus's TV show, are weird. Very, very weird.
What do you mean you didn't eat this? Who did?
The mythology, the world building, the characters, they're all just so very, very odd. And maybe the oddest part of the franchise is its moral, because throughout both the original trilogy of films and all 8 episodes of the show, it is preached to us over and over and over again that Scott Calvin, aka Santa Claus, is a terrible dad, an awful husband, and a pretty rotten Santa Claus. He's bad at just about everything, and everywhere he goes, he leaves a trail of destruction in his wake. Don't believe me? Well, today I'd like to take a closer look at this series and ask, what is it really trying to say? What's the moral at the heart of the Santa Claus franchise? And is this story a tragedy? So let's start at the beginning, which is 1. The Santa Claus. The conceit at the heart of the first Santa Claus movie is pretty genius. It's also wonderfully simple. Basically, Scott Calvin, a guy who is not particularly well suited to being Santa Claus, is forced to become Santa. In the process, he becomes a better man, a better father, and discovers the importance of magic, belief, and Christmas. What's especially fascinating in retrospect to me about that first Santa Claus movie is how little of it is geared specifically towards children. I mean, I enjoyed it as a kid, and I suspect most other children who watched it did as well, but also remember that throughout this film, the child character, Scott's son Charlie, is not the main character. Scott, a grown-up businessman, is, and most of Scott's problems are very adult ones to have. Difficulty at work, difficulty with an ex-wife, difficulty with the ex-wife's new husband, difficulty with a custody battle, and difficulty with a son who's at risk of becoming estranged from you. These are very grown-up problems to have, and in many respects, I think that this is a very grown-up film. I feel kind of silly saying that, but I think it's true, and I think it's a big part of why the film is so successful. Scott Calvin is a complex protagonist. He is flawed, he is snarky, he's made mistakes in life, and he's not particularly happy with where his life is at the moment. He's a middle-aged guy taking stock of where his life is at and deciding how he wants to spend the second half of it. And that's why the ending of this movie is so bizarre. You see, in most movies about a dad who's grown distant from a son, you'd expect the film's final moments to reinforce their bond, to reaffirm their connection, to let us know that they're gonna be okay. But in this film, the movie's final moments feature Scott saying goodbye to Charlie, Charlie's mother, and Charlie's stepfather so that Scott can go to work. Yeah, he just kind of leaves Charlie behind.
Listen to me. Come on, listen. There's a lot of kids out there, okay? Millions of kids. And they all believe in me. They're counting on me, Charlie, and I'm not gonna let them down. I got a lot of work to do.
So I can't be selfish either.
But wait, I hear you say, that isn't the final scene of the film. Well, yeah, there is a quick moment after that scene where we see Scott return to Charlie to give Charlie a quick ride in the sleigh. But ask yourself, how is their relationship any different now than it was at the beginning of the film? Because it seems clear that this new status quo is the same as it was in the beginning. Charlie will continue to spend the majority of his time with his mother and her new husband, and Scott will see him once in a while, popping in and out of Charlie's life in a less prominent role. Being Santa has not made Scott a better dad, has it? Setting aside the fact that Scott is now Santa, how is anything now more than superficially different than it was at the beginning of the film between him and Charlie? Well, I'd argue that it isn't. I'd argue that Scott's relationship with Charlie never really gets any healthier, and as evidence, I would like to cite 2. The Mrs. Claus. The Santa Claus 2, the Mrs. Claus, is kind of a mess, and I get the feeling that it's widely regarded as the black sheep of the Santa Claus franchise. The film follows two plot lines. First, Santa discovers that he has 28 days to get married or the magic of Christmas will disappear, and second, Santa creates a robot duplicate who becomes an evil dictator taking over the North Pole with an army of giant toy soldiers. Yeah, it's kind of a mess. Half Nora Ephron romantic comedy and half wacky kids movie. The narrative is a lot less tidy than the first films, and I get the feeling that the writers didn't really know where to take the story or these characters. Actually, the most interesting development in the film has nothing to do with either the North Pole drama or Scott's dating life. You see, in this film, it's revealed that Scott's son Charlie is now on the naughty list. Yeah, in case you thought that Scott was doing a great job as a father, his son Charlie is now a part of a list which, in the film's canon, definitively proves your objective measure as a good or bad person. And what puts Charlie on the naughty list? Well, he defaces his school with multiple instances of pro-Christmas graffiti. Yeah, I get the sense that Charlie might have some unresolved issues with Christmas, don't you? And that maybe those issues are related to his father? Charlie's principal actually diagnoses the problem pretty well, I think.
We're all worried about you. It feels to me like you're trying to get someone's attention. What's bothering you?
Yeah, and she also tells Scott flat out.
Oh, well, maybe if you spent more time with your son, there would be fewer problems.
I mean, you think? There's probably a much better version of this movie that isn't a rom-com about Scott's dating life. Imagine, for example, if Scott had seen that Charlie was on the naughty list and this was what prompted him to leave the North Pole and return home. But no, Charlie is not Scott's primary concern in the film. Instead, he's trying to find a wife and, retake the North Pole from enemy forces. There's a fascinating scene in the film's third act where Charlie, in tears, explains to his father how difficult his dad being Santa has been for him. And, well, just look.
What? Talk to me.
Okay, I don't live a normal life.
You live a great life here.
No, just listen to me. My friends get to go around saying, you know, my dad's a plumber, my dad's a pilot, my dad's a dentist. Well, you know what? My dad is the best thing of all, and I can't tell anyone about it. And you have no idea how hard that is, walking around that secret for all these years. And now on top of everything, you're going out with Principal Newman? I mean, you don't even tell me about it. My whole life has become about secrets, and I hate it.
That's heartbreaking, right? You feel for this kid. And how does Scott fix it? Well, he doesn't, really. Because you know how this film ends after everything that we've just seen? Well, once again, the last scene features Scott leaving Charlie behind. Scott is gone. Again. What has he learned? How has he grown? How has he become a better dad? Well, you only have to look to the third film for answers. 3. The Escape Clause. Now, before we discuss the third Santa Claus movie, I do, in the interest of full disclosure, have to admit something. Martin Short just gets me. I don't know why, but somehow the man's sense of humor just precisely tickles my funny bone. Maybe it's his childlike sense of joy, maybe it's his razor-sharp wit, or maybe it's the fact that I saw his 1994 film Clifford roughly 9 million times as a child, and that fundamentally warped my sense of humor. Who can say? But anyway, Martin Short is in the third Santa Claus movie, and for that reason alone, I'm inclined to say that it's the best one, but if you set him aside, well, it's a lot more complicated. In this film, Scott is still mostly absent from Charlie's life. In fact, Charlie barely appears in the film, putting in a little cameo where it's explained that he's going on a snowboarding trip with a girlfriend instead of spending Christmas with his family. which is meant as a kind of a throwaway line, but I think ends up being very telling about where Charlie's at in life. This is a kid who was very nearly suspended for his pro-Christmas graffiti, who longed to spend Christmas with his father, and now he's given up. He's given up on spending time with his dad. Consider that and tell me that you don't look back at that first film in a different light, right? But the third Santa Claus movie does have a happy ending, at least. You see, Scott is having a new baby, a new son, a son who will live at the North Pole with him and who Scott will presumably have a better relationship with than Charlie. After all, Scott has learned his lesson, right? Well, to answer that question, we have to see the final part of Scott's character arc. 4. The Santa Clauses. Nearly 30 years after the original Santa Claus film, a direct-to-Disney Plus series was released called The Santa Clauses, and, well, it's better than it has any right to be. Some of the jokes are good, it fixes some long-standing issues with the franchise's canon, and answers some long-held fan questions about continuity, and, well, overall, it isn't too bad. I mean, the effects are kind of awful, and the North Pole sets have received a significant downgrade, and they're also populated by maybe a dozen elves at any given time, but yeah, as a show, it's fine. But in terms of charting our character arc of Scott Calvin, that's where things get really interesting. Consider this. There is a moment early in the series where Scott visits a now-adult Charlie and offers him the role of Santa. All of Charlie's childhood dreams can come true, and Charlie will finally be as close to his father as he could ever be, taking on the mantle of Santa from him. And Charlie says no. Basically, Charlie is over that whole Santa thing, plus he has a wife and kids now, and he says, quite plainly,
I mean, you're a great father. It's the job, though. It's not conducive to being an engaged parent.
Oof, right? That is more or less a complete indictment of Scott as a father. Also, throw in the fact that Scott doesn't seem particularly close to Charlie's wife or children, with Charlie's wife not even knowing about Scott being Santa. And yeah, being Santa did not make Scott a good dad. In fact, it turns out it probably made him a much worse one. And what about Scott's new kids? Well, his son hates the North Pole and longs to be a normal teenager, and his daughter Sandra is incredibly lonely with woodland animals and a witch as her only companion. And Scott's wife, the one he dragged up to the North Pole in the second film? Well, this former principal has given up teaching elf school and is now so immersed in her role as Mrs. Claus that she has seemingly lost her entire identity.
Mrs. Claus doesn't have a first name. I don't have a first name.
It's Carol.
Carol was my before name.
What originally began as a fun fantasy film about this normal guy becoming Santa and learning to be a better person has ended up a horrifying tragedy about the steep human cost and collateral damage associated with a family whose patriarch has a demanding career. And that leads us to the moral of the story, which, well, get ready for this. 5. The tragic moral of the Santa Claus. At seemingly every point across 3 films and 8 episodes of television, Scott Calvin proves himself to be a bad family man. He screwed up with his first wife, is incredibly distant with his son from that marriage, has stifled his second wife's identity, and has damaged his second and third children in very severe ways. And all for what? Well, for his job, because Scott Calvin is Santa Claus, and no matter what else is happening, no matter what price must be paid, the Christmas magic needs to flow, right? You can't stop being Santa. The work is just too important, right? In the first film, Scott tries to abdicate responsibility, avoid it, ignore it, and yet it finds him and engulfs him. In the second film, Scott decides to automate the process, to take some of the load off him, and yet that also backfires completely. And in the third film, Scott discovers that he and he alone can assume the mantle of Santa Claus and that it can't go to Jack Frost, or in the TV show to Kal Penn's character. Scott must bear the burden, and his family must suffer. but it was all worth it, right? I mean, being Santa is more important, isn't it? And at least while his family was into charades, Scott was out there knocking this whole being Santa thing out of the park, except no, he wasn't. As it turns out, the naughty list has been growing, the supply of Christmas cheer has been shrinking, and, well, just look at this scene where Scott reunites with a little girl who he met almost 30 years ago and who he inspired with Christmas magic. She's miserable. She's sleeping on her parents' couch and doesn't even remember that it's Christmas Eve, despite the steep cost of Scott's sacrifice. Despite everything he has done, Scott has left no impression on her.
I don't remember much, man. I'm an adult woman living with my parents. I mean, my life is one endless, blurry, long day broken up by Judge Judy's.
Wow. Of all the kids in the world, I would never imagine that you'd stop believing.
Okay.
There is a moment in the final episode of The Santa Clauses where, after losing his powers for a bit and becoming a normal person, Scott is about to put on his Santa coat and become Santa again, and, well, it's not quite the triumphant moment the series seems to think it is. What is Scott doing but returning to a job that has taken so much from him and his family and given them so little in reward? In the series' final scenes, the final scenes of the entire franchise, well, at least we don't get the image of Scott flying away again, leaving his family behind, because no, it's worse. Now his entire family has become subsumed by his career. Yeah, they're all in the sleigh with him. Even though none of them seem particularly invested in this whole Santa thing, they're stuck there too. You know that thing that Charlie explicitly said he didn't want to do because it was a terrible idea? That is what Scott is making his other two kids do. In the end, I think it's clear that Scott should have never put on Santa's coat. It wasn't worth it. Not only did his family suffer, but the job that seemed so important ended up not having mattered that much at all. And although it's tragic for these characters, maybe it's also the best possible message for this family franchise to tell every parent out there that no matter how important your job seems, it is not worth sacrificing the things in your life that really do matter. And if you don't put your family first, well, things can get pretty bleak. And speaking of bleak, this is the end of our video, but don't be too sad. You can always subscribe for more content like this. I put out a new video every week, and I've also got a bunch of videos on my channel that I think you'll enjoy right now. I hope to see you next time. Bye!